Hi everyone, welcome to Love and Philosophy. The paradox we're holding here today is harmony and weirdness, specifically harmonizing the Dao and the weirdness of the world, which are both topics of writings and books. Weirdness of the World is a book title, actually, by my guest, Eric Schwitzgebel. Eric is an analytic philosopher and a professor of philosophy at the University of California Riverside. He's also the author of A Theory of Jerks and Perplexities of Consciousness. So just those titles probably already tell you a lot. I'm not sure if you've listened to my conversation with C.T. Nguyen, but these two philosophers, C.T. Nguyen and Eric Schwitzgebel, have been two of my favorite to read over the years because they always get me thinking deeply, and yet they're also real craftsmen in their writing. In this conversation, we discuss everything from robot consciousness to the love darts of snails, to triads, to axiology, to the philosophy of opening. It's always a pleasure to discuss the wonderfulness of being weird, and also to hold that alongside ideas about the Dao. So those are two words I know well. I hope you indulge in some weirdness today, and it's definitely one of the best routes to love. Loving what is weird can really open you up to the world in a new way. So be and do well out there, and here we go. Hi, Eric. Thanks so much for being on Love and Philosophy. It's wonderful to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
So we're going to talk about harmonizing the Dao today, among other things. That will hopefully lead us into a few other ideas relative to your work. But just to start, how did you come upon this phrase, harmonizing the Dao? When did this become an idea that you wanted to explore?
Well, I've always been interested in classical Chinese philosophy, at least, well, since undergrad. And it is a central idea in classical Chinese philosophy, especially my favorite Chinese philosopher, Zhuangzi. But you also see it in the ancient Confucians, and it's generally part of ancient Chinese thinking that there is this thing, the Tao, which we can talk about what the Tao is, and it's good to harmonize with it. So it goes way back into my roots in classical Chinese philosophy.
I wanted to ask you about that. How did you come upon that as an interest? Sounds like it started young.
As an undergraduate, yeah, right. So when I was an undergrad at Stanford, I took this amazing class with PJ Ivanhoe, who was a professor there at the time. And I just fell in love with the classical Chinese thinkers. And then when I went to graduate school at Berkeley, Kwang Shun was there, and he also studies classical Chinese philosophy. And he was delighted that there was an incoming student. I mean, most graduate students in philosophy in the United States don't know anything about classical Chinese philosophy. He was delighted there was someone who already knew a little bit about it and was interested in it. So he kind of took me under his wing. I TA'd for him and gave him comments on one of his books. And then PJ Ivanhoe had liked one of my undergraduate essays and asked me to turn it into a publication for an anthology he was working on. So it was actually my first publication was in the area. So, and I started learning the ancient Chinese language, and I was thinking maybe I would do a dissertation in that. I ended up not. But ever since then, it has been a continuing secondary interest of mine. I occasionally publish articles on it and regularly teach a class on it, even though my main research is in moral psychology and philosophy of mind.
I wonder about that. Was that a tension? I mean, you said there's not a lot of people in the States who go into Chinese philosophy. That might be changing now, but I wonder, in your experience, did you ever, it sounds like you had a very fortuitous experience in the sense that you kind of flowed right along. You were harmonizing with the Tao, so to speak. But
Right.
that's not what I usually hear, because I was also interested in it when I was younger, and I found it very hard to find a way in philosophy to do that. So I just wonder about that. Did you
Right.
feel that tension between traditional, especially analytic philosophy, and these interests in Chinese philosophy?
Um, Kind of yes and kind of no. Um, One of the nice things about PJ and Kwang Loi is they're very analytic. Well, nice thing to me, because I'm an analytic philosopher, right? Nice thing to me is that they're very analytic in their writing and thinking style. So it harmonizes with the style of philosophy that I'm comfortable with. So I was very fortunate to be supervised by two of the very best kind of analytically trained, analytically thinking um, classical Chinese philosophers just because of the universities I was at. So in that sense, I didn't feel a tension. In another sense, right, there's always been a little bit of it's classical Chinese philosophy has always been marginalized in the Anglophone tradition. And I think these days, people more than in the 90s when I was in grad school, professional philosophers in the United States recognize it as uh, potentially interesting tradition that has something to contribute. Um, but even so, they don't really know much about it. So you're always, when you're talking with people about it, you're always doing a little bit of introduction. It always seems a little foreign and alien to most, not to everybody, but to most philosophers in the traditions I work in.
Yeah, it can even be intimidating just to try to say the names. I find that right now that I feel a little bit nervous to even try to say them, even though I know them. But okay,
Right.
let's talk about harmonizing and Dao. We brought up both those words, so maybe Dao first. What I know we can't give, it's kind of everything and nothing, but what should people know about that word relative to this discussion?
Right. So the word means different things to different thinkers and different traditions. But the way that I want to use it, that I think fits nicely with my kind of secular 21st century Anglophone perspective in general, is the Tao is basically everything, but it's not everything conceptualized as a collection of things. Rather, the emphasis when you're thinking about the Tao as being everything is the processes and patterns, right? So, what is the Tao? It is the spinning of the earth, the coming and going of the seasons. It is the way that trees grow and die and shed their leaves. It is the way that people interact harmoniously or unharmoniously in society. It's all of that stuff conceptualized as the regularities and patterns of things.
I wonder, is harmony always harmonious, or is harmonization always about harmony? I mean, I think you say sometimes that, conflict is the harmony. So how do we unpack that a bit? Because it can just sound like, oh, we're trying to find this very perfect balance, which is almost like a stasis state. And that's definitely not what I got the impression you were discussing.
Right. So, yeah, there's a bunch in there. So we might have to do a little bit of it at a time in your question, right? So let's start with the stasis state, because I think that's one important difference between, especially Zhuangzi style approaches. And Zhuangzi, for those of you, your listeners who don't know, is one of the great ancient pre-unification Taoists, along with the better known Lao Tzu, who was probably a mythological figure, and people might know the Tao Te Ching, right? So alongside the Tao Te Ching, the other pre-unification, really ancient Taoist text is the Zhuangzi. So, and in that text, there's a kind of canonical 7 chapters, which are called the inner chapters, that are seen as the most reliable kind of core Zhuangist point of view. And we don't know whether Zhuangzi actually was a historical figure who wrote those 7 chapters, or exactly. I like to kind of think of it that way, but that might be a little bit of a fiction. Anyway, so Zhuangzi, um, stasis is not what's up with Zhuangzi, right? The coming and the going. And one of the big differences between a kind of Zhuangist perspective, I think, and a nearby perspective that you see in the ancient Greek tradition, especially Aristotle, as typically interpreted, is so you have this idea from Aristotle and virtue ethics that there's a thing called human flourishing that we should strive for. And flourishing involves being ethically good and being creative and being productive, maybe being beautiful, maybe being athletic. We can't have all of these things. right? But in a way, it's a static picture, right? You develop toward an ideal, and then you hold that hold that ideal form as long as possible, right? Whereas for Zhuangzi, death is itself part of what's being celebrated, right? The Tao includes the process of dying. And if you die in the right time and in the right way, then that's appropriate part of the Tao that is to be as celebrated as being born and flourishing in the middle of life. And likewise, things like disability, I think, are celebrated by Zhuangzi as part of the wondrous diversity of the world, rather than kind of having, in the at least the cartoon version of Aristotelian flourishing, you kind of have like a single ideal of the perfect frontimos wise person with all the virtues, right?
What about the D's? You mentioned death and disability. There's another D in there that you talk about in the writing. I can't remember it right
Yeah.
now.
Diversity,
Diversity, right. So yeah,
right,
that's messier than that Aristotelian or even Platonic. I mean, of course, there's differences in that, but
right.
picture. Um, yeah, but sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Just
Oh no, that's fine. Yeah. I mean, I
mm,
think one of the distinctive things about the especially Taoist version of harmonizing with the Tao, and especially within the Taoist tradition, Zhuangzi version, is that, well, if you think about the idea of harmony, already builds in this idea of difference, right? You don't have harmony if everyone's playing the same note,
mm, yeah,
right? Part of harmonizing is the instruments and the players doing their different things. So Zhuangzi, he celebrates the weird and the wonderful and the misfits. The inner
mm,
chapters especially are just filled with goofy characters like this king who has no holes in his face, no eyes, ears, nose, mouth, right? And then he's right. It's like, what's going on with this guy, right? Or
yeah,
some guy who's he's totally bent over and disabled, but he's got like the spiritual
yeah.
insight,
He's
right?
like
He's got all
magical
these,
almost. It's great you bring
yeah,
that up because when I was thinking about that connection with science fiction, I mean, it's too much to jump now, but there's a similar sort of freedom and beauty in this idea, which I'll just kind of
right.
pinpoint for now. But um, you were talking about the harmony, and that's different from the melody, right? What's that idea in there that we are not the melody? I think that's important too because that kind of gets at what you were just trying to talk about before I interrupted you about
Yeah,
everybody needs to play a different instrument and maybe sometimes even it's dissonant. So what's that idea that you're not the melody? You say that a couple times in
right.
different pieces.
Yeah. And I don't want to lose track of part of the initial motivation of your earlier question about
What is that?
conflicts in harmony. But let's get to the melody thing, right? So one of the things that I think is invited by, say, alternative views, but especially I think consequentialism, which is the idea that you should try to maximize good consequences, or at least that what's ethically good is maximizing good consequences. Um, that invites you, and you know, consequentialists can do various things to soften this, right? But at kind of first crude pass, it invites you to think, okay, this is the way that I think the world should be. So I should do whatever it is maximizes good consequences for the world. So everybody becomes, in a certain sense, the decider for the whole world, right? So if you have a button that you could press that would radically change the world, and when you do your calculus, you think, the odds are it will change it for the better, then you should press that button, right? And so should everybody else who might have different calculations, right? I mean, and it creates kind of uh, certain kinds of risk, right? So if everybody were in a position to risk the entire universe for something they think is good, then even if 99.9% of people think, you know what, the odds are that this isn't good, so don't press the button. If there's one person who does their calculation and says, oh, yeah, actually, the risk is worth it,
Mm.
then the button gets pressed, right?
We don't want that
So,
button. We might have that button, unfortunately, but yeah.
right. So that's the idea of being always the melody that I worry about, right? there's something admirable about, as it were, shouldering the burdens of the world and trying to do what's best for the world as a whole, and in some sense, treating yourself as the decider. But I think there are also downsides to that way of thinking. And another way of thinking that's more modest is to think, okay, the world is already flowing in certain ways. Not my job to direct it. I'm not the conductor. I'm not lead violin. I'm not the lead guitarist, right? My my role is harmonizing. So, I'm playing the triangle in the background or whatever, along with this awesome thing that's going on. And I want to do it in a way that helps it become even more awesome. Uh, but I don't need to be the one in charge.
And how does that open us to better understand what I was originally getting at, that harmony, value pluralism, or you brought up consequentialism, also deontology, the difference there. And because, like I was thinking of all the instruments and that we're all in different positions, and this can be very hard to hold this tension that we want to do the best for the harmony or for the melody. We want to do the best for the melody, but we're all going to have a different, even kind of experience of what the melody is and what our part is. Like that's a hard thing, I think, to really get a grasp on. But isn't that part of this difference between traditional value, propositional philosophy?
Yeah, so I am a value pluralist. I think there are many things that have intrinsic value. I also think there are many melodies and harmonies that are going on simultaneously. And so I harmonize in one way with the world when I do my thing, and other people harmonize with the world in a very different way when they do their things, and that can all be wonderful. So if I harmonize with the world by, I don't know, playing jazz piano at home, or by coming to my office and having conversations with people like you, right? That's my contribution. And other people, like, they go to the Renaissance Fair and they participate in that kind of like weird, amazing thing, and that's
Interesting
not my
contrast
thing,
to add there. Yes, that's true.
you know, but that's great, right? And other people, do other like things that I can't relate to at all. There are whole worlds of competitive sports that I like have no idea about, and there's a whole like something wondrous about all that. Um, but of course, they can come into conflict with each other, right? So any ethics needs, I think, some way of thinking about what to do when there are conflicting demands, right? So if my mother is asking me to do one thing and my wife is asking me to do the opposite, right, then I can't fully harmonize with either of their requests. And I need to think about, okay, what what unfolding patterns in the world do these different requests fit into? And which one do I prioritize more? Which one seems healthier? Is there a way to kind of harmonize with both through some kind of compromise action? Is there a way to recognize that actually disharmony in the short term can be part of a bigger harmonious picture? You don't want to necessarily just agree with everything everyone says, right? Sometimes you need to fight back, and that can actually be part of a larger, more valuable harmony that emerges over time. So, so there's not going to be, I think, part of at least Zhuangzi's ideal is that there's not a formula for answering all these kinds of questions, but there is kind of a mood or a spirit
Mm.
of flowing along with things, acting in a way that is harmonious and spontaneous and kind of respects what's awesome in the world.
It's more process, more pattern. So that gives us what does that give us? A kind of flexibility instead of the deontological rule-based take,
Right.
or the consequentialist where we almost have to assume there's going to be one consequence for everyone. So what does that give? Like, what kind of space does that open in your opinion? You could even, I think you talk about the university as an example, or the
Right.
planet, distant planet, or something. Like,
Right.
why would this be a nice approach for a distant planet or the university? Or
Right. So what I think of as the distant planet thought experiment is this, and this is a way of getting at what philosophers sometimes call axiology, which is the study of or thinking about value. So here's the thought experiment. So imagine there's a distant planet, it's blocked by the galactic core. We'll never interact with it. So what would you kind of hope that that planet was like? Would you hope that it's a sterile rock? I mean, I don't think so. I mean, there might be some people who would hope that, but that's kind of dark. Right? I think most of us will hope that it's not just a sterile rock, but that it's got life. And hope for just microbial life? Or would you hope for something more complex? Would you hope for plants and jungles and animals roaming around and the diversity of forests and reefs and all of that, not too much like Earth in some alien key. I think most of us would hope for that, right? Would we also hope that there is one or more species or entity type that is capable of philosophy and art and sports and falling in love and science and all of that? Yeah. I mean, I think the planet would be missing something if it didn't have that too, right? So I don't want to totally replicate Earth, but something like that, I think I would hope for. And I think most people, not everybody, would also hope for that if they're kind of benevolently hoping this planet into existence. That would be great. So that's one way of thinking about, okay, what has fundamental value independent of our interests? And I think, and I wouldn't want it to just be a planet where everyone was an Aristotelian phronimos, right? I'd want like a diversity of stuff. I would want all kinds of wild and weird things. And it would be
yeah,
a disappointing planet if all humans were the same and all animals were the same, even if that sameness was fit some kind of ideal, right? And it would be a disappointing planet in a way too if there was no conflict, right? There's a richness that comes out of um, diversity and conflict that I think we would be missing if we had too simplistic a planet, right? So think about a kind of flourishing world like that as a manifestation of Dao. And it's going to involve entities that die, right? It's going to involve prey predator relations, probably. I mean, maybe there's a way to imagine a planet that doesn't have that. I'm not sure. Right. So that's the kind of thought experiment that I want to invite as a way of thinking about axiology. And then you think, okay, bring it back to Earth. What kind of planet do we want Earth to be? And not in a consequentialist way, figure out how to press a button to bring that about, but think that Earth is already has a lot of elements of that and could potentially have even more of that, have even more of a flourishing Tao. And in what ways can I participate in that, contribute to that, help it be even better, help other people participate in it, contribute to it, and improve it? So that's the kind of overall way of picturing the axiological and ethical ideal of harmonizing.
so we want all that diversity and death and disability, actually, because that's sort of an assessment from one position, and from another position, it's actually, the way that we're getting all that good stuff that you just said, that seeming chaos, that all those different instruments, creating new kinds of music, things like that, which
Right.
doesn't fit very well with something like the traditional, we make some rules and then everyone has to go only by those rules.
Right.
Is that connected to the weirdness? Because
Yeah.
you're a well-known philosopher for many things, and who knows how many we get to talk about today. But one is this word weird, the weirdness of the world, and do you see a connection there in that holding all those tensions, letting all those things be, and the weirdness? of the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I mean, that's one of the things that I love about Zhuangzi is his celebration of the weird, right?
Mm.
Where, and I mean weird in a somewhat technical sense, right? Something is weird in the way that I mean it if uh, it doesn't fit into our ordinary understanding of things very neatly.
It
It kind of
violates common
it
sense, I think you
violates
said.
our expectations about how things normally go, right? So, right, the wonderful thing about Chuang's writing is he's got all of these weird characters and plants and animals even. And part of the wondrousness of the world is that it has these weird things, that it defies our understanding, that it's got a diverse set of events and entities and processes that, right, we can't really fully grasp. And one of the things that I think is worth doing is appreciating the fact that the world is more wonderful and wondrous if it doesn't all fit into the neat packages that we understand.
Yeah, I like that you use the word awesome a lot. And you seem to have a lot of joy in the world. And I feel like your embracing of absurdity is somehow connected to that. Am I wrong, or am I, or not absurdity,
Yeah,
but this of the weird, which I know is,
yes, right. I think one can react to the fact that the world defies our understanding in one of three ways. I mean, you could deny that and say, no, I understand it. Here's my answer to everything, right? Or you could say, yeah, I don't understand it and be distressed. Or you could say, I think I don't understand it. And it's kind of, there's something awesome about the fact that the world defies my understanding. And yeah, I want to invite readers to the third reaction, which I think is not well represented among philosophers. I think Zhuangzi is one of the few philosophers who who appreciates the fact that the world defies his understanding, as opposed to being a distressed skeptic or a dogmatist who says, no, here's all the answers.
yeah, it's wonderful you brought that up because I was thinking of that, how that's connected. The weirdness is almost a way to hold the tension or hold the paradox. I like to say that a lot, or those options, because okay, the world is really overwhelming even in all its beauty. I mean, sometimes it's just too much beauty and crazy amazing forms. And how can you even go shop and like look at the shape of the broccoli? I mean, it's like incredible, and
Right.
that's too much. And then but then on the other hand, so you do want order and stuff like this. So we're constantly, it's not, we're thinking of it as if we're swinging between extremes, but there's maybe another way of thinking about it. And when you were talking, I was thinking of the triad. There's a quote in one of your pieces or that you use
Yeah.
about like forming the triad. Do you remember, do you know what I'm talking about? Could you,
Yes, I know what
yeah.
you're talking about. Because I think that the pure Zhuangzi is pretty radical. And there's an element that needs a little toning down. He's wild, right? In the good and the untamed and the maybe not, I mean, maybe we don't want to be quite as wild as Zhuangzi, right? So there's another thinker of the era who offers a different picture of harmonizing with the Dao. And I think that the my preferred picture is some kind of compromise between these two thinkers. And this other thinker is an ancient Confucian named Shunzi. So Shunzi has this picture of the world in which the world is a triad of heaven, earth, and humans. So what he means by heaven and earth is pretty close to what we mean by kind of natural phenomena, right? So heaven is the pattern of the seasons, the fact that the rain falls at a certain time. Earth is things like, you know, plants and trees and clay and the basic way things work, right? So the wilderness is composed of the processes of heaven and earth interacting with each other. But then there's a third corner to the triad, which is human society, right? So on Shunzi's view, the ancient sages, ancient even to him, and he was working in the 3rd century BCE, so very ancient. So the ancient sages discovered the rituals and patterns and customs that would allow human beings to get along harmoniously with each other. So a noble woman should act this way, a farmer should act this way, merchant should act this way, right? So we've all got our patterns and our roles, and a harmonious society, everyone kind of fills their roles and fits into their pattern. And that society also harmonizes with heaven and earth, right? Especially like the farmer needs to plant at the right time and sow at the right time. And you need to build houses in a certain way if they're not going to fall down and if rain's not going to get in the roof and that sort of thing, right? So Xunzi has this picture where harmonizing with the Dao is playing your part in this well-ordered, harmonious society that is in turn harmonizing with heaven and earth. Now that's a little constrained, right? Especially Xunzi really emphasizes, kind of playing your role in society and conforming to traditional rituals. And that's a little bit of a straitjacket, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think we should be Confucian traditionalists.
Yeah, that's where the
Right?
wildness comes in.
Right.
The
So
other side,
we need that Zhuangzian wildness and to recognize. But I think there's a real value in Xunzi's picture in thinking of belonging to a society and having certain roles that you play as part of a valuable way of harmonizing, right? So I'm a university professor, right? So there's certain things that I should do to kind of in the harmonious way of being a university professor, and that includes treating students a certain way and grading in a certain way, maybe. But then on the other hand, right, maybe a Zhuangzian wants to like defy the usual grading conventions and maybe give everybody A's, right? Whereas a Shinzian would say, no, there's this tradition where people have to get different grades, right? And how exactly that all plays out is complicated, right? But some kind of compromise between this Shinzian valuing of a harmonious, well-regulated, orderly society and the Zhuangzian wildness.
So that's the weirdness too, because there's something I feel like in your writing you're also saying we want to be able to hold the space and let things be weird. We want our common sense to be violated up to a point, or to be, I mean, violated is a weird word, but we want to be surprised in a sense.
Right.
We want, these things that you're saying. Is that is that part
Yeah.
of it too? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think the fact that we do not understand the world is amazing. One of my favorite examples of this is garden snails. I just have a certain affection for garden snails. In my
I love
chapter on the
that. Yeah.
weirdness of the
It's
world,
a
I have a
wonderful
whole
part of your
chapter
work.
about garden
Yeah.
snails, right? And if you wanted to, we could talk about how weird garden snails are. Like, especially their mating is like really
Yeah, you
strange.
should tell people. I mean, I'm sure they can find it, but it is pretty wonderful, actually.
I mean, if you want me to give you the lowdown on the garden snail mating, we could
I
do that
mean,
right now.
I would like a little. I'm sure you have a couple sentence summary by this point.
Well, what's amazing is that it's so hard to summarize in a couple sentences because these snails, they've got 60,000 neurons in their central nervous system, right? It's like an ant has 250,000, right? So they got these tiny little central nervous systems that are mostly in ganglia that are clustered around their esophagus. So it's not even clear that they have something worth calling a brain, right? And they engage in this 7-hour, like really complex mating process that involves like shooting love darts at each other. These are these calcium, this mucus covered calcium arrows that they shoot into each other, and then they're
It's incredible. This is
simultaneous
love and philosophy, so
hermaphrodites.
this is very pertinent, actually. The love darts.
Yeah, love darts, right? And they're simultaneous hermaphrodites, and they don't have very much vision at all, so they've kind of got to simultaneously insert their genitalia into each other, and they
Yeah, it's
circle,
crazy.
and that's complicated for them, and they circle around each other, tasting each other's slime trails, and it's like really complex 7-hour procedure, right? And these entities are doing this with 60,000 neurons. And so So that's wonderful already and amazing and weird, right? But also, one of the things that I want to think about is, do they have conscious experience? Is there something it's like to be a garden snail, right? So some philosophers and biologists will say, yes, there's something it's like to be a garden snail, just like there's something it's like to be a person or to be a cat. They have experiences, right? Others will say that there's nothing it's like to be a garden snail any more than it's like we normally assume, although some people question this, to be a plant, right? So they're kind of just mobile plants, basically. Um, and I think we don't know the answer to that question. It depends on what theory of consciousness is right. And we don't know what theory of consciousness is right. We don't know if consciousness, if having experiences depends on something like being able to conceptualize yourself as a being who has experiences, right? Some people think that in order to have experiences at all, in order for there to be something it's like to be you, you have to have a subjective perspective, an understanding of yourself as a subject, an understanding of yourself as an experiencer, right? Every experience on these kinds of views comes along with a kind of reflective knowledge of itself, right? So, and if you require that kind of fairly sophisticated apparatus, probably garden snails don't have that, right? But you might not, experience might not require that. Experience might be a much simpler kind of thing. And as soon as you have sensation, basically, that's integrated with other cognitive processes, you've got experience, and then snails maybe have that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I got these garden snails and they're in my yard, they're eating the daisies, and I have no idea whether they're conscious or not, right? There's like this mystery of the universe, right? Right in my backyard, having very complicated sex. And yeah,
Yeah,
that's kind of
it's
like
magnificent.
wonderful.
Of course, I mean, we brought it up and it's part of your writing consciousness and it's a whole, I mean, that could be hours and hours, but it does really bother me that we use this word in such different ways. And I mean, those snails are alive, so why, and they're obviously sensing even no matter how we use that term. So isn't that a sort of consciousness? I mean, it's not being conscious of your consciousness, it's not being
Right.
self-aware, but why, how do we just jump past that? I never understand in terms of phenomenal consciousness. I feel like phenomenal consciousness is talking about that, but we mistake it as as knowing that we're conscious, or the snail knowing that it's conscious. Do you have any good advice for me of how to really disentangle that? Because it really bothers me, and I've read all these texts, but it still bothers me.
So I myself lean gently toward a relatively liberal or abundant view of what kinds of things are conscious. And I like snails, so I kind of want to include them in that. But let me articulate the alternative view, which I think is might be true, and it's certainly worth taking seriously. And I kind of touched quickly upon what I think is the most attractive way of conceptualizing why consciousness might be much more sparse than we ordinarily think. And that's this. So, conscious experiences have, at least in the typical human case as conceptualized by some thinkers, but that's already two important asterisks, the following two features. They're subjective in the sense that there's always an experience, every experience has an experiencer. There's a sense in which consciousness is always presented as, for me, right? It's not just that there's, you know, a flower, but there's a subjective perspective that I bring upon the flower. It's like I'm experiencing the flower, right? So the consciousness has this kind of subjective for me-ness inherent in it. And it might be that in order for an experience to have an inherent for me-ness, I need to have a concept of myself as a subject. It doesn't necessarily need to be in words, right? Maybe an infant could have it, maybe a dog or a monkey could have it, right? But the kind of sense of, I'm a self, and here's a thing. And there's a difference between the self and the thing. right? So subjectivity in that sense often is thought to belong to conscious experiences. And similarly, what philosophers sometimes call luminosity, right? So a lot of people have thought, again, in the typical case, and maybe it's not right, right? But a lot of people have thought that every experience comes along with some kind of grasp upon itself, right? So if you are experiencing having a visual experience of a flower, there's some sense in which you know that you're having that experience in the process of having that experience, or at least you're in a position to know that you have the experience in virtue of having that experience. But in order to but in order for that to be true, you have to be the kind of entity who can self-ascribe experiences, who understands what an experience is. Again, maybe not verbalizably, right? But if it's true that every experience comes along with some kind of understanding of itself or capacity to understand itself as being experienced, then again, there's like some cognitive sophistication, some ability that seems to be involved in that to understand yourself as an experiencer and the world as containing experiences. So if you accept those two features as being inherent to all experience, then it looks like maybe you need a fairly high level of cognitive sophistication in order to have experiences. And maybe it's limited to social mammals and birds, basically. And once you go beyond that, you're not having like a lizard. Does it have a concept of itself as a subject? Does it have a concept of itself as having experiences? You can, that might
What
be
about a
too much
cell?
of a stretch.
I mean,
And no,
I think
a
this is a
cell
little,
wouldn't either,
yeah,
right? On this view, right? So I'm just trying
yeah.
to articulate. I'm not saying this is right,
No,
but
I
I'm
know.
trying
I
to
know you don't
articulate
necessarily believe
the
it, but
yeah, I'm trying to
you
articulate
articulate something different, even in
what
the
I find.
book about weirdness. But
Yeah, right. Yeah,
but
but
I
I
really
want to
see that
warm people up
weirdness
to
as
the
a way to
idea.
hold this
Yeah.
stuff. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, the idea is it's an exercise to warm yourself up to how someone might reasonably think experience is limited to a fairly narrow range of animals.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you articulated that because it's very important, and that's a very important view. But I feel like it assumes already a relationality with a body's relationality with itself, which isn't relationality. I feel like you can have relationality and therefore consciousness without it being of the same position or entity in question, you know? So yes, like an infant or whatever, they are conscious. I mean, they're alive in my opinion, because to try to break apart the idea of an entity that's sensing as that entity, to break that away from consciousness for me at that very basic level feels a little bit ridiculous. And but it also feels really understandable because we come into knowing ourselves, right? And that's what we think of as
Yeah,
consciousness. But that happens like way later, and it happens through relation. And I'm bringing all this up because it does
yeah,
remind me of some of the things in your book, the weirdness, and I feel like that's another way to hold that. But first, I'll just stop and
yeah.
let you correct me if you think I should be corrected about that, or how you see just life itself and the capacity for any body to be in relation, to make its way through an encounter, to sense, as like how you can separate that from a consciousness in the sense of the most basic sense on the Glasgow scale, or you know.
So I think that one thing that makes some people hesitate about this, but makes other people go not hesitate and maybe go to more radical conclusions, is that fungi and plants also seem to sense in slower motion. But there's all this interesting research recently on how trees communicate with each other through root networks and mycorrhizal fungi and all that kind of stuff. And bacteria are pretty complex in their interactions with each other, more than maybe had been appreciated a couple decades ago. And could say even a toy robot, if it gets camera input into its eyes and then is programmed to respond in a certain way to that input. Want to say that thing senses, right? So you end up, whether you go for life or something like sensation, you might end up with a pretty radical view of like what things are conscious. So you might end up saying, yeah, well, trees have conscious experiences too, and so do simple robots, and
But that's different. That's different.
so do groups of people,
I mean,
right?
the weirdness, right? It's always going
Yeah,
to be weird, as you point out. I think that's very
right.
important. But that's exactly the thing that I think gets confused a little bit is that for a tree or something to be sensing and conscious doesn't mean that it has to be conscious in our experience of consciousness, which is what usually what we mean of being aware of ourselves. That's a very nuanced thing, I think. But if you just
Yeah,
think of a body sensing as a child is or something in relation, it doesn't have to be aware of itself as that body. And also, the human body is a completely different kind of body than a plant. So why would we
yeah,
think that a plant's going to have anything like our consciousness, our experience of consciousness? So for me,
right.
it's like we're already imposing all these human definitions of what it means to be a sensory body onto everything. And then, of course, it's crazy to say a plant is having a human experience. I mean, that makes no sense, but it does drive us crazy that when people say that because that's what we assume. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And also, like with the robot, to me, that's a pretty easy one. I mean, people think it's not so easy, but there's no affordances that are pointing back to that robot. They're pointing back to whatever created that robot. Maybe we get to a point where there are affordances specific to that robot, but I feel like all these complicated questions about what life is, of course, get involved here, and it's not easy in that
Yeah.
sense. But in the sense of just a sensory body, it doesn't seem that complicated. If we can take away this human lens that everything that's conscious has to be conscious in the way that a human is. Does that make any sense to you?
I would, I think there's an ambiguity in the way that you phrase it, and I'm not sure exactly which side of this ambiguity you come down on. I have a guess, but so when you say something isn't conscious in a way, in the way that a human is, a tree isn't conscious in the way a human is, you could, I think everyone would agree with that, right? If it's conscious at all, it's gonna it's gonna be very different from us. Um, does it have experiences in the sense that philosophers sometimes articulate by using the phrase, there's something it's like to be a tree, right? Is there something it's like to be a tree or multiple things that it's like? It doesn't have to be one thing, right?
Yeah.
But does it have a flow of experience, however alien from humans it is? Does it have a flow of experience? Or can you think of sensation as something that happens even without a flow of experience? So you could say, okay, yeah, there's a sense in which trees have sensations, but a lot of people would say, no, but they don't really have there's nothing it's like to be a tree. They don't really experience things, even if they sense things in a certain way.
They're encountering the world and so as to continue encountering the world. That's all I mean. Of course they don't have I mean we this is why it's so complicated because we think of
Yeah,
senses through our human body and so on, but and it
yeah,
reminds me of your other beautiful piece which I hope we get to about the golden rule and extension and so on, but
yeah,
I'm not trying to put myself in the position of the tree, but if we were a
yeah,
tree body,
yeah,
it's just a different way of relating with the world, just so as to continue as the tree. I just think if we can get to the most basic of that,
yeah,
that's what I think we mean. I would mean by being conscious of the as a tree, but it has nothing like it's not what I mean by being aware of myself as a human being, and that is really, really, really hard to tear apart because as soon as we use those words, we're thinking of the tree as experiencing the world as we experience it. I feel like it's part of that practice that you talk about in terms of extension here. Something complicated has to happen there before we could even
right,
really understand how to dissociate those things.
right. Yeah, you can also think that just the question, is there something that's like to be a tree? Does it really have experiences or not, no matter how alien? You could also think that question is in some sense already a mistake to phrase it in that way, as though there's a yes or no answer to that. You
Exactly. That's
could.
that triad I was trying to bring out in the weirdness. Yeah.
Right, right. So I think for every question, there are at least four answers. You could say yes and you could say no, right? And the way I was articulating it assumed that a yes or no answer, does a tree really have experiences, would be right. But there's also always some in between, like, well, kinda, kinda yes, kinda no. Can't really quite say either of those answers is quite right. And there's also always a fourth option, which I call gong, which is to like bang a gong and say, it's not yes, it's not no, it's not in between. The whole question is broken from the start, and you kind of think in some different way rather than in thinking in the way that's presupposed by the frame of that question,
Yeah.
right?
Or you
So
just have to get
yeah,
really kind of, you have to understand that we're actually using language, which was invented through human relation and experience. And like, you have to keep going
right,
down the rabbit hole, until you can begin to kind of imagine or extend yourself into thinking of a different kind of body, which is having a different kind of encounter with the world, which we would use words like sense and experience to talk about.
right. So one way of thinking about this gong option, right, would be to say, if I were to ask you, is our prime numbers red? You could say, yes, they're red, or you could say, no, they're blue, or you could say, well, it's kind of in between, they're kind of purple, right? Or you could say, and here's the gong option, that question is just like not the question you should be asking. That doesn't really make any sense, right? So yeah, so I think it's totally reasonable to think that I think any of those answers for a garden snail or a tree, I think all of those four answers are on the table. It could be, in my mind, right, that a garden snail or a tree really has experiences. Of course, they'll be alien from us,
I mean,
right?
how
Or
can
you
you
could
have
say,
love
look,
darts and not have
it's blank.
experience?
It's blank, right? There's nothing going on inside. That's the no, right? Or you can say, well, kinda like, does
Mm.
experientiality have to be like yes or no? Or maybe it's somewhere in between. I've got a whole paper about this I call borderline consciousness, right? Or you could say, hey, look, just the question doesn't even make any sense. When we ask whether something has an experience, we have all these presuppositions built in our concept of what an experience is. Like, for example, we might think, when we think about it in terms of there's something that's like to be an X, right? Maybe we're already presupposing that there's a connection between this, what its likeness, and having a kind of self-conception and all that. And the concept isn't kind of inherently problematic, and we should probably just maybe get rid of this whole concept unless we want to limit it to cases like humans.
That sounds like, to go back to the harmonizing with the Tao, that sounds like that either or again. And the third space would be, well, let's look at this question and what is it? It's language, and where is it coming from? And
Right.
how is all that stuff built together? And then you kind of do open up this weird space, which I feel like is the space of where perhaps new things could come from it. That justified doubt that you talk about, or is it dubiety? Is that
Yeah.
is that related here at all? Does that give us a little bit of a third space to kind of step that might end up being a portal into a different understanding?
Yeah. So, um, yeah, the one of the main themes of my recent book, The Weirdness of the World, is what I call the universal dubiety thesis, right? All of these big picture claims about consciousness and cosmology are dubious, right? We don't know where the truth lies among various possibilities. All of the possibilities are bizarre. They violate or defy common sense in some sharp way. And you can't really escape that, I think, once you start thinking about these concepts carefully, right? But we don't know where the truth lies among these various bizarre options. So that's the dubiety claim. And then I think that there are various good things that come from recognizing our incomplete understanding of the world. And some of those are traditionally recognized, that it's good that you don't claim you know things if you don't actually know them, right? But then there's also maybe those less recognized. The world is more wonderful in a certain way if it defies us. The world becomes richer for us if we don't understand certain things about it, right? The world is more full of possibility. If it's possible that the snail has experiences, and it's possible that it doesn't, or it's possible that it's some borderline case, or it's possible that the very conception of experience is already so laden with suppositions that we should maybe move on to some other different way of thinking about things, right? All of those, as once we recognize that all of those are live options, now my garden is richer with possibility, right?
Yeah, it's like a whole other universe. It's like a
there's
science
a
fiction book
yeah,
that's real.
there's a universe of possibility in there that if I kind of already think I know everything, doesn't exist.
So is this a reason to do philosophy? Is this a reason to read science fiction? And is this a reason to do philosophy? Is there a connection there at all? Like,
Yes to both questions. Yes to all three questions. One reason to do philosophy, and I call this the philosophy of opening, is so here, let me contrast the philosophy of opening and the philosophy of closing. So in the philosophy, so imagine you enter a philosophical conversation thinking there are three viable theories: theory A, theory B, theory C, right? If you're trying to do the philosophy of closing, what you're doing is try to close off, say, possibilities B and C, and say, theory A, that's the correct theory, right? And then you've closed off these possibilities, and you've got this thing, which is good. The theory A is right, right? But the philosophy of opening says, hey, here's another way to learn. Maybe theory D is correct. Maybe theory E is correct. So you add to your sense of live possibilities you hadn't previously considered. So maybe you hadn't considered the possibility that the very question of whether consciousness exists in a snail should be gonged off the stage, or you hadn't considered the possibility it could be a borderline case and had assumed it has to be yes or no, right? As soon as you add those possibilities into the mix, if those possibilities deserve a certain amount of your credence, then you've opened up your sense of how the world could be rather than closing down. So I think one thing that philosophy can do that science fiction also is really powerful at is expanding our sense of what's possible, knocking us out of our presuppositions about, okay, here's how things have to be. I feel like I understand this, right? Let's be imaginative theoretically and about maybe what could exist in the future or what could exist technologically, right? And the right kind of imaginative exploration can open our sense of possibility for the world. And that is, I think, I think that's both intrinsically valuable and instrumentally valuable. It's intrinsically valuable because the world is better. This planet that we're on is better if it's inhabited by entities who are struck with wonder at the various wild possibilities that could be out there, right? Rather than kind of dogmatically with their noses down on here's my truth, right?
weird is wonderful.
But it's also instrumentally good in the sense that I think we're not always what we think is true is not always true. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it might be that A was right all along, and by adding D and E, you added confusion, and those were wrong. But often, maybe it turns out that D is right. And if you're not opening yourself up to possibilities, then you might be just heading down a path without realizing that path is not where you should be headed.
Yeah, and maybe when things change, it'll be good that you had already thought about those other options, even if B is right
Yes,
for now.
right.
I just had a discussion with Kevin Kelly. You know Kevin Kelly? He's a Wired magazine co-founder,
No,
technology
I don't
guy.
know him.
Well,
Yes.
I think you'd find him interesting because he's a big sci-fi fan. And he was talking about how he's kind of predicted a lot of the things that have since happened in terms of technology. And he was telling me a lot of it comes from reading science fiction because he already knew what a computer should be like before, there was such a thing and so on. And he said we should sort of cite our science fiction. I wonder what you think about that and if that strikes a chord in you at all in terms of how your reading experience of science fiction, which I'm assuming you had young. I think I even heard you say you did when you were a kid, and then you picked it back
Yeah.
up with Egan, maybe.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
how does that feel like it's been important to your work that you've done?
Yes, right. So I'm a fan of science fiction, and I think there the mode of exploring possibilities that you see in science fiction is has a similar spirit to the kind of philosophy that I like to do, which involves exploring possibilities. Absolutely, I think that philosophers and others should engage with science fiction and cite it if that's the direction their lives are taking. I don't want to be a prescriptivist. Well, everyone's got to go read science fiction, right? But if you're interested in this kind of opening your mind toward wonder and thinking about possibilities that you haven't really considered before, then science fiction is a great tool for doing that.
And opening
Uh,
to the weird in the way we've been talking about, I think it sort of
yeah.
gives it a little more, what's the word, like credence or something, that you could understand it as a way to get ideas, open the space in the openness way that you just described.
Yeah, right. So one of my favorite books that I've read recently is Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun, right?
Oh,
So
I
this
haven't read
is,
that yet. I love that author though, but
yeah, he's a wonderful author.
mm-hmm.
And he occasionally writes science fiction as well as writing, you know, non-science fiction, literary fiction. So he's got this wonderful book, Clara and the Sun, which is told entirely from the point of view of an artificial friend, a service robot who's conscious. Seems pretty clear, right? That she has all these experiences, and she is utterly devoted to the well-being of the girl to which she's been assigned as a friend. And she completely treats her own interests as secondary to that. She's wholly defined her interests, not wholly, but almost entirely defined her interests in terms of the well-being of that friend. And it's such a lovely portrayal of a kind of devotion, which is in a way beautiful, but also in a way so limited, right? And I think as a reader, you want to say, Clara, you matter for your own sake too,
That's
right?
fascinating.
You are an individual who is an equal of any human, right? But that would never occur to her. And it's told so perfectly from her perspective that she never voices that thought, that the reader, at least me, I'm like desperate to, to assert that thought for
Mm.
her.
I can
And
imagine that
yeah,
tension. Just knowing his other work, I'm sure he builds that tension
yes,
very beautifully.
right, right.
But
So,
you also write
yeah.
science fiction, don't you? I
Yes,
mean,
I
yeah.
do. I do. Yeah. So, and I'm interested also in, these questions about we might think of it as robot existentialism, right? Like, what if we are going to someday, and maybe we will, and of course, it depends on what theory of consciousness is correct, right? Whether we will or how soon, right? But if we someday create robotic entities that have inner lives and experiences, probably not quite like ours, but maybe in some important ways like ours, then what is the meaning of life going to be like for them? And we shouldn't just assume that it's going to be like what it is for us. And we shouldn't just design them so as to maximize our interests. They will have interests of their own that are worth considering. So one of the many wonderful things you can do with science fiction is start to think in a more sophisticated way about this possible future toward which we're heading.
Yeah, as you were telling me that example, that reminded me of that extension. I mean, maybe you want to give a little brief idea of it, but you're kind of saying, okay, the golden rule is good, or put yourself in the shoes of others is good. But another idea is that you can use this idea of extension. So the people closest to you, you sort of, you can probably describe it better, but you think of what it might be like for those people closest to you. Like instead of telling the king to put himself in the position of, whatever, someone he's going to punish, think, okay, well, what if it was your son or something like that? And when
Right.
you were talking about the robot, that's kind of a reverse extension, isn't it? A little bit, or some kind of way of, through science fiction, giving us that.
Yeah. So, right. So the idea of extension, and yeah, in some of my recent work, I've contrasted it with the golden rule. So the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And it's very similar to this idea of imagining yourself in someone else's shoes, right? And then you kind of do for them what you would want if you were in their position. But there's something about, and there's it's a wonderful rule, and there's something I really like about it. But there's also something just a little that great rubs me just a little the wrong way about it, which is it kind of takes your assumed self-concern as the basis of morality, right? So you kind of imagine yourself in someone else's position, and then you say, if I were in that position, what would I selfishly want? Or what would I want for myself, right? So there's a kind of like imagining your own self always involved in this. So it puts yourself at the center of ethical thinking if you're always doing it this way. And Mengzi, the ancient Chinese Confucian Mengzi, has this different way of thinking about how to expand your concern for others, and that is to base it in immediate concern you have for those nearby. So he's this wonderful example. He says, maybe the most famous passage in the Mengzi is, he says that anybody who suddenly came upon a child crawling at the edge of a well and about to fall in would feel this moment of alarm and compassion. And they wouldn't do it because they want to get in good with the neighbors by rescuing the child. They wouldn't do it because they would be annoyed by the child's screams as is dying at the bottom of the well, right? They wouldn't do it because they want to be famous or anything like that, right? It's a pure concern for others that manifests in this kind of spontaneous response, right? So Mengzi thinks that we have, with respect to nearby others, whether they're physically nearby, like this child about to fall into a well, or whether they're kind of relationally, emotionally nearby, like your close kin, we have this spontaneous concern for them that doesn't involve us at all. Mengzi's not saying imagine yourself in the child's shoes and about to fall into the well and what would you do, right? There's none of that self-reference. There's this assumption of this immediate natural concern we have for others. And the way to develop morally, foundationally for Mengzi, is to expand that to more distant others, to notice that others also maybe deserve that concern, right? So he has this wonderful dialogue with this king who feels compassion for this ox that's being led in front of him and is about to be sacrificed and killed to consecrate a bell. And this king is this terrible, vicious king who's, going, invading his neighbors and killing the civilians in the neighboring territory. And Mengzi says, and the king at one point says, how could I care for the people? Like he just assumes like he doesn't care about peasants, right? And Mengzi says, hey, look, you had concern for this ox. Certainly you could have concern for a peasant. You just notice that when the thing is nearby, you're concerned for it. So just extend that concern that you felt for the ox to the peasants beyond the wall, right? To say that you could have concern for an ox but not for a peasant is like saying you could see the tip of a hair but not a cartload of firewood. Of course you can have concern for peasants. You just need to reflect on it, imaginatively extend the local concern for what you have nearby to the more distant cases, right? And that kind of extension, he's not saying imagine yourself as in the peasant's shoes. He's saying notice that a peasant also would be afraid of death just like an ox. And if you're concerned for the ox, you should be concerned for the peasant too, right? So there's no imaginative self-transformation involved in Mengzian extension, which I think is nice because it kind of takes you, it makes you less central to the picture.
I like that a lot because it feels like we're going into that third space or something and noticing our continuity with what's around us in a different way, which feels very important to me. But I asked you, like, is science fiction a way to do this? And I asked, is philosophy a way to do this? You said yes to both. And we don't have that much time left, but I did want to bring up, you've done this whole other, you have this whole other world of thinking about ethics and actually doing a lot of, studies and things about ethical concerns. And some of what we're talking about here, when I think about that work that you've done, seems almost contrasting, which might be wonderful in the overall melody, But because, for example, you found that ethicists aren't necessarily more ethical. I mean, I'm generalizing a lot, but
Yeah.
like a vegetarian ethicist isn't necessarily more ethical than I don't know. You could probably describe it better, but somehow there's a contrast there in terms of it feels like we're doing all this philosophy in order to become more ethical or improve our life or something, and then in
Right.
the studies that you've done, that's not really the opening is not really opening. It doesn't feel it feels almost more like what you're describing as closing. So how do you hold that in your ideas of all this?
Yeah. So I've done this series of studies, mostly collaboratively with my former student Joshua Rust. Um, done the series of studies on the moral behavior of ethics professors. And what I found over and over again, with a couple exceptions, is that they behave basically the same as other professors, right? And other professors is the right comparison class because they're similar educational backgrounds, similar socioeconomic status, and that sort of thing, right? You look at how ethics professors behave on a variety of measures and how other professors behave basically is the same. So it doesn't look like a life of studying ethics is having much impact on how people actually behave. And I find that a little disappointing. Now, some ethicists, when I talk to them about this, are like, well, it's an academic endeavor and we should expect an ethicist to be good at writing papers and teaching classes, but like, why think they'd be better in real life? And I can see how someone might think that, but I also think, look, if you spent your life studying the ethics of Aristotle and Kant and Zhuangzi or whoever you're studying, shouldn't that have some kind of positive ethical impact on your life? And if not, has something gone wrong?
Yeah, it's
So
fascinating. And I'm
yeah,
remembering what you say about the like on the one of your questionnaires, you ask, is vegetarianism better or should we not eat meat? And people
yeah,
will say, yeah, we shouldn't eat meat. It's probably ethical to eat less meat or something. And then you
right,
ask, okay, what did you eat for dinner? And it's like, oh, I had meat. And
right,
that seems, that kind of, I think, is an illustration of what you were just describing. But
right,
also, as you were talking, I'm thinking, okay, well, what about harmonizing the Tao? If we maybe actually or being the tree or all these other themes we've been talking about, maybe what if you bring that into that world? Because even those studies and the way you just described it are set up in a very dichotomous way of you're going to say yes or no, and yeah,
right,
everyone's already educated in a way, so in a sense, like the critical thinking is a part that's probably actually changing the way you behave towards others. So these yes no questions maybe aren't reflecting that. So I mean, does that make any sense to you if you tried to open up into the third or thinking about it in this more Taoistic way? It
yeah,
actually might just be they're being inconsistent when they say they had meat, but not necessarily less ethical.
yeah. The world is complex. And so I think you can say, and I'm an example of this actually, right? So if I had been a participant in one of my own studies, or one of the ones on meat eating, I would have said, yes, regularly eating meat is not morally good. And yet I actually eat meat pretty regularly, right? So I myself an example of the kind of phenomenon that I'm criticizing. So I want to own up to that. And I want to say that in some sense, it makes sense to have high ideals and recognize that you don't live up to them rather than rationalizing and defending yourself always, right? So I think there's a tendency for people to say, "Oh, well, eating meat, there's nothing wrong with if they eat meat and they don't want to give it up, right? There's a tendency to say, "Oh, so there's nothing wrong with it," and then they come up with the story. But I think sometimes what we should do is say, "Okay, look, that story doesn't necessarily work, and shouldn't we recognize that we're not ideal and we maybe aren't harmonizing as well as we could or should with our ideals?"
But also, you're not the melody. I think it's great you brought up yourself because
Yeah,
um, just interacting with you a little bit. We don't know each other, but I have a sense that you're actually just you really care about your family, for example, I've seen, and you have this space of care that's very obvious about who you are, and you can feel it in your writing too. And I would imagine that that comes through the way that you are in the world, in the sense that you are noticing, which is a philosophical practice. And all of that kind of goes into what you're really asking in those questionnaires, but it's not reflected in the questionnaire because it's a dichotomous yes no thing. And
Yeah,
because like what you're saying about like that everyone's going to have a different instrument. Some people maybe should be vegetarians, or should is a weird word, but
right,
maybe that's the right choice from some positions and others not. And maybe
right,
it is either or maybe you do need to hold that tension in the way we've been saying, where both aren't always right or always wrong. But, there's a different way of thinking there that I feel like you're trying to open up with the weirdness and the harmonizing the Tao.
right,
And, does that
right.
make sense to you at all?
It does. I mean, I'm doing this ethics professor stuff, and it has to be simplistic because if you're going to do like real scientific psychology, you need clear measures, clear dependent variables. It needs to fit onto lines where you can, come up with averages and do statistical tests. And I want to participate in that way of doing science because I don't think anyone had ever before Josh and I did it, and anyone had ever done that with the question of do ethicists behave ethically. So let's like get some numbers and do some t-tests and stuff like that, right? So uh but yeah, of course it's simplistic, and while not wanting to be self excusing too much and saying, hey, look, you know, it's fine to eat the meat of animals because that's just part of how I am harmonizing with the Tao. It's not my priority to shape that side of my life in that direction, right? While not wanting to like let myself off lightly with a rationalization, at the same time, I do think it makes sense to say we need a certain kind of forgiving ethic. And one of the nice things about this harmonizing idea, as opposed to an idealized consequentialism or idealized virtue ethics, so you can say, look, there's only so much you can do. You're only playing one note. You have a limited life, and you've got to make choices about where your priorities are, in what respects you're going to live an ethically good life. And it's not realistic to think that you're going to be ideal in everything. So you need to make choices and find your own way of participating in this awesome thing, which is this amazing planet full of cool, impressive, wonderful, incomprehensible stuff.
Yeah, well said. I have to ask you about love before we go. And
Yeah.
it is a word that comes up in your work in all kinds of different ways, which is wonderful as a philosopher in the way that you use it. But in the context of this conversation, what does that word bring up? Or when it comes to this idea of the melody and the harmony and so on, or care? Care is another word that you use a lot that's very connected. Do you have any thoughts about connecting those dots at all?
Yeah. I haven't written much about love. One thing that I'm attracted to is some version that's close to Harry Frankfurt's idea of when you love someone or something or some process that involves wanting good things to happen for its own sake, right? For the sake of the beloved. So I like that idea a lot. And I've thought about a little bit in the context of love in marriage or conjugal love, right? And what's involved. There's this kind of, I think, almost paradox, not quite a paradox, in the marriage vows, in the sense that you are promising to love someone forever, in the sense that you're promising to build a life jointly with them where what you want is their good for their own sake. And how can you promise that when you're 25 years old? Because who knows what your lives are going to become. And love for a spouse is going to have to be contingent upon their developing in a way that harmonizes with your values and your life projects. And if you go different directions, which of course you could, then it can no longer be that. So, so the marriage vow involves this kind of trust in the other that they are already firmly enough on a path that you can join with them together, right? So even though there's a contingency that you can only continue to love them in the Frankfurtian way, if they retain certain features, right? At the same time, you're trusting them to retain those features, and you're committing to harmonize and build a life together with them that retains the features that on the basis of which you can continue your love.
I think that speaks very beautifully to the weirdness, actually, because yeah, I think it is a paradox that we decide when we get married that we're going to be with someone and we're both going to be changing because we have no, I mean, yeah, you could marry when you're 25 or 55 still. In 5 years, you might be completely different. You might be different people because of everything that's
Right.
happening. So you're holding this space where you're going to be yourself changing and you're going to love another person who's changing and you're going to be this third entity together and so on. But
Yeah.
if you enter into that with an understanding of the weirdness, and the way we've been talking about, the way you write about of that you can't fully, everything that's true is going to be a little bit strange. That seems
Yeah.
like a beautiful way to think about love in a sense. I hadn't thought of it till now, but
Yeah. You can't fully anticipate it, and you can't totally keep it inside the box. In a way, the marriage vow is a leap into something that you know is too complex for you to understand and fully anticipate. And there's something beautiful about taking that leap.
yes, definitely. And I think just the fact that you could harmonize, just to come back to that, or that you could even
Yeah.
experience the Tao in this extended way that we've been talking about through that relationship is actually very potent. And
Yeah.
if you can stay with it and be part of that, it is, I think, really worth it. But
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any final thoughts or anything you want to say before we go. I know we have to go now, but I just want to say I really appreciate your work and all
Yeah.
these things that we've opened up here. And there's plenty more that you've opened up for me too. So thanks. Is there anything before we go that you want to be sure we say or talk about?
Well, I've enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that the world has become more wondrous for containing it.
I think it has for sure. I mean, if only because we learned about love darts from snails, then, you know, but there's
Yeah.
many other reasons too. Thank you, Eric. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. I hope you have a
Thanks for having me.
good day there on the other side of the world.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you're off to something weird now. Please support the show in whatever way you can. It really helps. I'm doing this in a weird way, so anything you want to contribute, any ideas you have for how to keep this going, I welcome them and I appreciate you. All right, bye.